All right, so I think we've got a good number of attendees in the call now, so I'm going to go ahead and begin. Welcome everybody to the Stimson Center. My name is Courtney Weatherby. I'm a research analyst with the Southeast Asia program, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to this morning's book launch discussion with author Kit Norland and our commentator and interviewer, Dr. Lian Hang Nguyen from Columbia University. So just a little bit of background on the Stimson Center for those of you who have not joined a previous event. We're a think tank based in Washington, D.C., and Stimson has a very long history of working to address the impacts of conflict and build practical and creative solutions for a more sustainable and peaceful future around the world. So Stimson was founded in 1989 and has a 30-year track record of work on a very broad range of issues, organized really across 4 key themes: protecting people, preserving the planet, promoting security and prosperity, and grand strategy in pivotal places. Our Southeast Asia program began work in 2018 on the War Legacies Working Group, which seeks to build partnerships throughout the United States and Southeast Asia to address the consequences of the Vietnam War, including unexploded ordnance, Agent Orange, and mine clearance. As part of the work that we do on War Legacies, we're always pleased to host book discussions and other discussions about the legacies of war and the history. And so we're very delighted today to welcome Patricia Kit Norland and Dr. Lian Hang Nguyen to have a discussion on the Saigon Sisters, Privileged Women in the Resistance, which just came out earlier this year. So I'm briefly going to introduce you to both of them, and then I'm going to turn the conversation over to our 2 experts. So we're joined today by the book author, Patricia Kit Norland, who's a former public diplomacy officer with the US Department of State. Kit most recently worked as an officer within the US Department of State in Vietnam. She's the translator of Beyond the Horizon and the author of Vietnam in the Children of the World series, as well as her recently launched book, The Saigon Sisters. Dr. Lian Hang Nguyen is the Dorothy Borg Chair in the History of the United States and East Asia at Columbia University. She is the author of Hanoi's War, An International History of the War for Peace in Vietnam, the forthcoming book, Tet 68, The Battles That Changed the Vietnam War and the Global Cold War, and she also serves as the general editor of the Cambridge History of the Vietnam War. She's currently working on a study of gender and people's diplomacy during the Vietnam War era. And at Columbia, she's the founder of the Vietnam Studies program. So with those introductions, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to our 2 experts to really continue this conversation. And I very much look forward to learning things throughout today's session as well. So thank you both for joining us.
Thank you so much, Courtney. If I could continue with the thank yous before I begin, I would love to do that. First, I would like to thank the Stimson Institute, and in particular the War Legacies Working Group, for holding such an important event, and to Courtney for that kind introduction. I'd also like to thank Tommy Vallely. He's the director of the Vietnam program and Ash Center of the Harvard Kennedy School, for introducing me today to today's author. And what I would just like to say before I begin with my very brief comments, because I want to turn right to the conversation, which I think is why we're all here today, is to talk a little bit about Kit. As the daughter of Foreign Service officer, diplomat parents herself, she then joined the Foreign Service. She also became a Foreign Service officer and a diplomat. And I think, by being born abroad, born in the Côte d'Ivoire and spending most of her life abroad, I think that really made her attuned to really hearing stories and being someone who really appreciates oral history. And I think that's a very important aspect of Kit's life that I think really comes out in this very important book. So, in terms of just giving you all context about the importance of Saigon Sisters, as someone, as Courtney introduced me, I'm a scholar of the war in Vietnam. As my career spanned about 3 decades, I've come to basically appreciate that, there are many, many titles. According to one author, about 30,000, upwards of 30,000 titles on the war in Vietnam. Now that's a lot of books, a lot of histories on that conflict. This one is exceptional, and here I want to lay out why it is exceptional. As someone who studies the Vietnam War, of those 30,000 plus books, the majority focus on the United States, on how the United States became involved in that war, how it fought that war, and how it extricated itself from that war, and on American experiences. And of the American experiences, the voice that comes out the strongest is, of course, dominated by men. So they're male-centered voices. As a result, something like the Saigon Sisters is making a huge intervention in Vietnam War literature because it looks at the other side. And here's where, professionally, my interests, my scholarly interests overlap a lot with Kit Norland's. As the author of Hanoi's War, I look at the other side of the war, but even there, I look mainly at male voices that come from the top rungs of party power. It was only on working on that smaller project, and now my current one, which I hope to make a larger project that Courtney referenced, the focus is on women, gender, and people's diplomacy during the global Cold War and in Vietnam in particular. And there, it's really that I started traversing on the terrain that Kit Norland knows so well. The intervention of Saigon Sisters is huge, as I say. This is a masterfully narrated and deftly edited book. And as a result, we have whole new vistas opened up to us regarding the war in Vietnam, covering the period from about 1950 to present day. Saigon Sisters includes firsthand accounts of 9 incredible women who were, in their own words, and this is an important phrase that I think we should continue to remember, were part of a generation at the crossroads. While all 9 were elite and privileged women who first met at the prestigious Lycée Marie Curie in Saigon as teenagers, that doesn't mean that their experiences were either monolithic or that they were only unique to this very privileged socioeconomic class. They were very diverse, and in many ways were universal and representative of people and of women of that generation. I told Kit that I had the honor of reading this book while I was with my family, my mother and her older sister, who were in fact born in the first half of the 1930s and lived in Saigon. And so very much looked up to women like the sisters in Kit's book. So I think what you'll see in the course of this conversation that we'll have with Kit today, this book is exceptional for what it tells us of these 9 women and these new perspectives about what is possibly one of the most written about events in modern human history, the Vietnam War, and that it will give us, a window into what motivated people, young women at the time, and hopefully clues to what can motivate the young once again as we face such cataclysmic times globally. So with that, I just want to dive right in. Kit, please tell us about Saigon Sisters, what it is about to you as the author, as the editor. Tell us how you came about to write this book and why.
Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Nguyen, for being part of this. And I also thank the Stimson Center for hosting this event. I thank the Saigon Sisters and their families who shared so many memories and so many stories. And I thank my family and friends for being supportive through a very long haul. I'm very grateful, and there's several mentors on this program, and I just hope they know how much I am grateful. So the spark for this book took place in Saigon in April 1988. At the time, I was working for a small nonprofit organization called the Indochina Project. As you mentioned, we normalized diplomatic relations only in 1995. So this was the period in between the end of the war in 1975 and normalization. And it wasn't very common to get visas, but we went in April of '88, and it was an effort with a church group to assess what some of the needs on the ground were. And we had a lot of, frankly, uninformative briefings until one day we met in a private home with a social worker named Juan. And Juan spoke beautiful English, and she gave us a much more down-to-earth, honest, candid assessment of issues stemming from the war, all the traumas, the poverty, the dislocation, etc. So I was very impressed, and I went up to Juan afterwards, and I said, "Thank you so much. This was a great briefing. I learned so much. By the way, where did you go to school?" And the 3 most unexpected words tumbled out of her mouth: Lycée Marie Curie. And there was something incongruous about this very humble woman thinking about the needs of the poor. And here she had graduated some years ago from the most prestigious school in Saigon, Lycée Marie Curie. So to make a long story short, the end of next year, in 1989, I returned to Saigon with 30 Maxell cassette tapes and was able to meet Juan and her small group of people who had graduated from the Lycée in 1950 and had returned and rekindled their friendship after the war. And this is a group of 9 women, and they all graduated in 1950. One group overnight went and donned black pajamas and went into the maquis, as the resistance was known, in the jungle. About a third were sent abroad by very worried parents because their girls had been protesting in the streets of Saigon. The Sûreté Générale, the colonial security police, was developing files on these students. So a group are sent abroad to safety and security. And then a third group stays in Saigon, taking care of parents, siblings, but finding interesting and subversive ways of nevertheless contributing to the resistance. So we have them scattering in 1950. They're all unified in the desire to dislodge the French from colonial approach in China and to struggle for independence for their people. And in terms of the bigger picture, here we are in 2020. I couldn't say it better than you already have. We have so many books on this monumental event in 20th century history, but we have so few told from women's perspectives. And this is a unique perspective. These are women of privilege who had real choices on how they were going to spend their lives. And they all decided that the most important thing was to dedicate themselves to the independence of their country. Having been born as your mother and aunt in the early 30s, they really span a remarkable period of time. They lived in a French colony. They went to a French school where the curriculum was imported directly from the Department of Education in Paris. They wore jupes, they had French clothing and blouses. They wore their hair in pigtails. They were given French names. Juan becomes Lucie, Han becomes Julie. So they're in this French cocoon, but they all end up having to find a way to find freedom, and then they endure the French War, the American War, reunification, a difficult peace. So there's a lot of span of life there, and there's a lot they have to share.
I should point out, in reading the book and thinking about 1950, we're at the 70th anniversary of these momentous choices that they made in their own lives. And as you were just saying, you were carrying out this research before reconciliation. And of course, about 2 decades after that, marking and the summer is the 25th anniversary. So we're coming upon these round anniversaries, and I think that that's amazing. Just to pick up on just where you left off. So this now that it's in its 70th year of this momentous decision to join the Maquis in 1950, when the Saigon Sisters graduated, many of them graduated from the Lycée. Could you tell us a little bit more about what is basically the first part of your book about the cause? What made the Saigon Sisters decide to leave their, the bosoms of their family, the comforts, the creature comforts that they enjoyed in Saigon, and go into the jungle and serve the resistance?
Thank you for that question. And I have to say, you have insisted that I may call you Hang, so I'm going to do that, even though you're I so respect your work. This is the heart of the book in many ways. They came from very privileged backgrounds. They could go overseas to study, perhaps to stay, but they chose a very different path and a very dangerous path. So there are really 4 or 5 themes that all the women touch on in describing why they chose to do this. And I think one of the first ones is how rich Vietnamese history is. And it's a long history of getting rid of invaders, of removing the oppressors. So many of them grow up in households that are steeped in this history and literature and the importance of homeland. And I'd like to draw out a quote here that I think is particularly telling of this point in its time. He says that father spoke with emotion about students he supported, whose patriotic and revolutionary songs we memorized starting when we were 10. It was completely natural. We grew up in the revolutionary ambiance. Our parents sent us to French schools. People wanted to have a diploma, a good life. For us, things were a little different. Ever since we were young, Papa taught us about our glorious history driven by patriotism. We are Vietnamese and must chase out the occupiers. He taught us to love the homeland. So I think that really evokes one of the strong motivating factors. Another one is this timing of, as one of them calls it, on the hinge of feudalism. While they are attending a French lycée and reading about liberal ideas, they're growing up also in homes shaped by feudal and Confucian thinking. And yet they're exposed to the modern world. So they're at a generation at a crossroads. They're being exposed to many ideas going on in Europe, the French resisting the Nazis. They're reading about Balzac and Victor Hugo, and yet they're coming home to very traditional homes. And along with learning about the importance of their homeland, they also learn that in the past, some of the decision makers in their history had been women, but that with the spread of Confucianism, as one said, national heroes had all become men. As the French and Vietnamese cultures intersected, one sister said, freedoms increased and feudalism was questioned. A lot of women stood up for their rights. They did not want to be stuck at home anymore. So another one underscores this by saying we were living a contradiction. Father sent us to a Western school while remaining feudal to his core, believing girls can't do everything boys can. And despite in that family, the girls winning so many awards and prizes at this prestigious lycée, it still didn't change his thinking. So clearly the women feel that there is more that they want than what their mothers had. One is very forthright in saying, Liang An, frankly speaking, my mother was a person of few ideas. Women of that time did not have ideas. They took care of the home. They had nothing to do with politics. My grandparents were very rich, Liang An said. At that time, young girls were not meant to go to school. But clearly these women, by being sent to the lycée and see that there's a lot more that they want out of life. And a third theme that runs through all the accounts, Hang, is the role of culture, the role of music and plays and poems and literature. And by pure coincidence, one of the sisters, Thuyen, her brother, Lu Hu Phuoc, was an incredibly gifted composer of music and simple lyrics. And as Thuyen, one of the sisters, says of her brother, my brother composed songs inspiring people to join the cause. Len Dang urges students to march forward. It became known as the National March of the Students. Almost everyone knew the songs, and it's easy to remember lyrics. And when Phuoc went to Hanoi, the University of Hanoi, he was very smart, very brilliant. He met Chan Van Pei, who was another musical genius. And as together, and I love this phrase by Thuyen, they made something that caused a furor. Through music, the revolution had more of a chance to succeed. All the women talk about Chan Van Pei and Lu Hu Phuoc and their music and their songs, and it's something they absorb and they all know, and it's a very big, powerful point. One other sister points out that a lot of songs at that time, because the French are still in control, had to be circumspect and simply evoke historic moments like big battles against the Chinese or the victories at Bac Dan River. So there was, through subterfuge in different ways, these cultural forces really spurred the women that they needed to follow in the long tradition. Finally, on culture, of course, one of the biggest cultural touchstones of all is the 2000 verse epic poem, the Kim Ban Kyu. And the girls, and I say girls because they were still teenagers, when they were at the lycée, they learned Vietnamese as a second language, and it was taught by Mademoiselle Lan. And one of her favorite things was to teach the Kim Ban Kyu. And there too, it instilled in the girls a strong sense of pride and appreciation, and they didn't feel like just being second-class citizens in a French colony. And one last theme to discuss is 1950 itself. There were three triggering events that really kind of stoke that all this has been building up, and decisions have to be made, and they have to take action. And the first one was in January, the death of a student, Chan Van-eun, and he was shot by the French police, and the students were very enraged. And a few days later, all the students in Saigon lycées marched through the streets. It was like rivers of people. And at Lycée Marie Curie, a couple of the girls made a banderole, a banner. And one of the smallest, literally, of the sisters was very proud to hold one end of the Lycée Marie Curie banner when they protested against the death of Chan Van-eun. So you have all the students out in the streets. Then in March, interestingly, March 19th, there's a ship visit by two American ships, the USS Stickel and the USS Anderson. And this does not sit well with the students. As one said, people marched to demand immediate departure of the US war vessels. Their presence came across as an operation of intimidation. We resented Americans coming to aid the French by putting on a naval parade in the port of Saigon. Then the third and triggering event in basically the first 5 months of 1950 was May 1, the International Workers' Day. And a couple of the girls know that their parents don't want them to march with the workers, but they slip out of the house early in the morning and they join, they march, and they're once again ready, stoked, and it's time to take action. We've touched on it very briefly. One other theme is the lycée, the milieu at the lycée itself, the teachers that they're exposed to, French and as well as Mademoiselle Lan teaching the books, the liberal ideas, and mentors, people who took a really special interest in their educational growth. As Sun, one of the most wonderful, they're all wonderful, but put it, at Lycée Marie Curie, we received a liberal education. Teachers taught in a multidimensional international way. We read classics. We learned about Russia by reading Tolstoy and Chekhov. We became aware of the American Declaration of Independence, Jefferson, Washington, Lincoln, even Benedict Arnold. And Sun is very clever in adding that as we compared notes, we found the ideals of liberty, fraternity, and equality were not for our people. Why? As a people inferior in no way to the French of the late 18th century, we decided we would see these ideals come true and translated into reality. In other words, we needed our own revolution. So those are some of the themes that run through as these young women of privilege decide it's not enough to just sit at our school desks. We need to take action.
There's so much there in that answer. I mean, just my mind was racing with, of course, we've seen this theme again and again, using the master's tools to tear down the master's house, which has happened again and again in populations that have been oppressed, using precisely the education, the tools that they were taught by their masters to tear down the whole structure. And of course, on the other side, we know so much about the role that culture plays for the American counterparts of this generation, the music, the impact of music, and the role that music played in the 1950s and 1960s, the counterculture. We know so little about the role of music and the role of culture in motivating the youth of Vietnam. So thank you so much for that. If I could turn now to ask you about, a little bit more, could you describe what life was like in the Maquis then? So now the Saigon Sisters have decided to forsake all of this. They're motivated, they've seen, they participate in the demonstrations after the death of Deng Van-eun, and they left. So what was life like in the jungles?
Wow, this is another extremely compelling set of stories, because again, the juxtaposition, some of these girls were chauffeured to the lycée. They lived in large villas. They ate French food. They used Maggi soy sauce. They had French names. They had everything at their fingertips. So what's really striking is how easily they adapt to life in the jungle. It's mind-numbing. I mean, as one Leanne said, and she came from one of the richest families, she said that her maternal side was astonished to see how she, as an upper class girl, became like a peasant and can do all the hard work of daily life. She had been a finicky eater. But after the resistance, she could eat everything. She used to sleep on a soft mattress. After living in the resistance, she could sleep on straw on the ground, or in what many of them used, which was called a nop, which was a basket, almost like a sleeping bag woven of grass. And to avoid the mosquitoes and flies and snakes at night, they would burrow into these nop. And but poor Leanne found that when she pulled it over her head, it was hard to breathe. So she eventually figured out a way to put a little mosquito netting at the hole so that she could breathe. What's even more remarkable, though, is that they had to face French bombing runs. As Shen remembered, one night bombing alerts could happen every day or maybe once a week, but they were always afraid. But soldiers would dig trenches for each person to protect them from the explosions. They were cut deep and straight to absorb the shock. So the women are learning to work the land and work under the hot sun and sleep in a woven basket and fight off not just mosquitoes and leeches and things, but French bombing raids. So it was a very remarkable transition that those who went were able to make.
I hope we're able to get into a little bit more about life in the Maquis during Q&A when we open up to the general audience, because it's such a rich part of the book. And when the first time when I read it, I picked up on the Mamru versus Nước Mắm, which I'm a big fan of Mamru. But anyway, so this is just to try to read this book. If I now, we need to kind of move to the second part of the book. If I could ask you questions about part 2, in which you talk about sort of war and the aftermath. If I could ask you now, if we could turn our conversation to what I call in your book the big disruption, which is 1954 and when the country is divided at the 17th parallel. What happens to the Saigon Sisters? What choices do they make in this division of the country, and what impact does it have on their lives moving forward?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. It's somewhat similar to 1950, where they're flung in roughly 3 different directions. Several women do the unexpected, which is leave Saigon and go to Hanoi to be part of the Democratic Republic in Vietnam and contribute to the government up there and hopefully to the unification of the country. I mean, we have to remember that the Geneva Accords were meant to call for elections within 2 years. So those who went north in 1954 thought at most they'd be back in 2 years. Many did not come back for more than 20 years. But so we have some going there. We have 2 returning from overseas. One who has studied social work in La Crosse, Wisconsin, at a small Catholic college called Viterbo, and Swoon, who returns from London, where she has studied at the Royal College of Music, and she comes back with her husband Lau to contribute to the future of their country. And then others again remain in Saigon, taking care of parents, but finding these very courageous ways to, in their own way, contribute either overtly to the resistance, working with liaison agents, or more directly with the people, providing cheap medicine, providing medical care. So those who lived in Hanoi, of course, endured grueling wartime conditions, stuff that just left me stunned when I heard about it. For example, Leanne recalls that from 1964 on, while living up north, parents had to send their children over 100 kilometers out of Hanoi to protect them from U.S. bombing. They would make the trip by bicycle over 2 nights in 1 day to minimize exposure. And each department, she was in the education department, was responsible for setting up a camp and for its members' children and to help raise them. So during one of the 12-day bombing runs of Hanoi, many inhabitants left, but actually Leanne stayed and read some communiques on Radio Hanoi, which is just phenomenal that she survived. And Liang An recalls that her children, they often had to stand in lines to get staple foods, but somehow her kids would sort of make a game of it, and they would take turns running and holding the very important position in the line. But anyway, it's all to say life was very difficult up there, and they ended up staying a lot longer than expected. Meanwhile, those in Saigon are not having a picnic. They endured terrible suffering. There's one who played a role specifically as a spy, and she puts it, she was prepared for any sacrifice or risk, even as she assured authorities her mask was that she was not involved with the resistance. So she resumed her activities with what she called the inner city tendrils of the resistance with an alias that required her to live with another agent in a house in a quiet neighborhood, which allowed her the security she needed to use the old Roneo machines to copy pro-resistance documents and to distribute them. Her sibling, actually, Min, is also still in Saigon taking care of her mother and actually some nieces and nephews because of dislocation, but very complicated. But Min, as she puts it, she led two lives. She had her external life as a teacher, and underneath she had another face, the face of militancy. And she worked with student and cultural movements. As a teacher, she joined something called the Association des enseignants privés, an association of private teachers, which was actually a revolutionary group under cover of an official association, without which the teachers would not be able to meet and organize. But then for Min, in 1960, a liaison agent in the resistance is captured in Phnom Penh, and he was carrying a lot of files with him. And arrests were made in the order of the name in the files. And the French, as she said, wanted to strangle the movement. They wanted to bludgeon it. And at that point, wherever they were, they just stopped cold. And we had to stop our clandestine activities and take a breath. But I mean, this is the kind of atmosphere in Saigon. There's one other small account that I think brings it to life, which is by Sun, who gives a real flavor for how difficult it was under Ngo Dinh, especially after his law passed in 1959, which gave tribunals full power to arrest, imprison, execute anybody for revolutionary activities. But Sun is very poetic in capturing the challenges of living in Saigon then. Diem was trying to consolidate power by launching a bloody campaign in the countryside against former Vietnamese resistance, and by conducting a kind of McCarthyite witch hunt in the civil service to find those supposedly supporting the other side. This was the anti-communist movement that culminated in inquisitions and the guillotine, stalking the land to claim the heads of former resistance and to strike fear in the hearts of the people. So she and her husband decide they can't stand on the sidelines anymore. They have to get involved. They have to help. And unfortunately, then her husband is arrested as a spy and given a 5-year sentence. I will just close this section because I know time is of the essence with a great little quote by Sun's husband, Lau, who says, "I met a lot of American journalists because he had started a newspaper to try and support people seeking a middle way. Walter Cronkite once asked, how can the Viet Cong vanquish the Americans who are 1,000 times better equipped than the French had been against the Viet Minh? I replied, the Viet Cong were 1,001 times better organized than the Viet Minh had been against the French." So wherever they were, their families are tremendously impacted and profoundly affected. But hard to go into all of that now, but yes, they all paid a huge price while doing what they felt they absolutely had to do.
It's so clear, the sort of the theme of endurance in the second part really comes out in the book. And it is amazing, sort of what these women lived through in terms of the birth of two nations and the problems that both of these nations faced in this post-colonial moment, be it the First Republic under Ngo Dinh Diem in South Vietnam or the DRV at war. What happens to Saigon Sisters scattered throughout is that they endured a lot, and it had a huge impact on their family lives, on their professional lives. I have so much more to ask you, including what happens to these Saigon sisters after the war and in times of peace. Do they reunite? But I think what we're going to do, if we could, we'll turn it over to the audience, and Courtney's going to come back in because you and I will continue this conversation, but we should let others in.
I agree totally. Thank you very much, Dr. Henry.
Yes, so thank you to everyone who's already posted questions in the Q&A box. We have, I think, 7 or 8 of them ready to go, which I'll ask, but please feel free to add additional questions in, and I'll be moderating that during this session. So our first question for Kit is both a note of congratulations. It's a great book from Murray Hebert. Murray notes he doesn't want to detract from the women's work during the war, but he's curious about how they feel after the war, when the revolution faced serious economic problems and introduced some unpopular policies. So can you talk about after the war ends, the sisters' feelings on these issues, and were they disappointed?
Thank you, Murray. And thank you. Murray and Linda were one of my bosses at Indo-China Project who sparked this interest in Vietnam. So I'm very grateful to both of them. And that's a really great question, because these women have a very wide political spectrum, from several like Juan or Twin or Shen who say, I don't like politics, I don't want anything to do with politics, it's only because they saw the suffering of their people that they felt they had to do something. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have some people who really probably did go as deep as possible into the ideology and were a little less questioning. But some folks like Shen and Tuyen have some very strong views about how disappointed they are and how disillusioned they are. That Tuyen has some great passages about those people who used to be so simple and live in the jungle and be happy with a bowl of manioc. Now they find that they like living in a villa and they like luxury. And Twin has a really good note. She studied with Georges Boudaret, one of the French communist professors of philosophy and so on. She describes learning about Marxism, Leninism, and communism as a beautiful ideal. It is like religion, a search for justice which is not yet achieved. So I think some of them have some very perceptive and I think quite piercing commentaries about what went wrong after 75, and I think we can learn from those. There was definitely disappointment. I think overall there is a sense that they had to do what they did, but I'd say a good half of them are disappointed that the revolution didn't meet its goals. But
if I could just jump in here. This is also there in the first part when you have, very astute observations by the Saigon Sisters when they joined the Maquis, that just like their counterparts in the United States that joined the anti-war movement, why were women who joined this cause relegated to serving the men? One of the sisters, San, notes the sort of gender dynamics of having to marry off young girls to old men to serve the cause. So you do have these critical voices throughout Saigon Sisters. And this is where I say it's not monolithic. So thank you.
No, very good point. Very good point. It's from the beginning, there are concerns.
Well, and I'm actually going to sort of select the next question is based on where that conversation started going. So Jonathan Formella had asked, how were the women received by the guerrillas in the jungle when they joined the movement? Was their elite background in their education useful? Did it give them positions of relative privilege, or did their French education lead them to be somewhat distrusted? And I'll add to that, the gender aspect that you just started speaking about.
Well, Hang and I can tag team this one. Again, it ran a pretty wide spectrum. There were some who definitely felt that they were disrespected for having been ever part of the bourgeois and having had privilege and so much more than anybody outside of a pretty small rung of Vietnamese whose parents worked directly for the French. So there was resentment of some of them. Others found that the fact that they did forsake comfort and security and privilege to be in the jungle and use a coconut shell to eat manioc, that actually reflected very well on them. So the range of acceptance was quite wide, and from very good to distrustful. And then to your point, Courtney, there is definitely a case or two of young girls being married off. It was, you do it for him, it's good for the cause. You're doing it for the country. Getting married to somebody who's maybe not the best match. But a couple of them just put their heads down and say, I'm gonna be just as good a combatant as you are. And they prove themselves to do so.
That's the perfect response. I think one of the things, this question gets to a really good point about, you know, when I'm talking about diversity of these experiences, that I'm sorry, no one ever calls me, that what again, using sort of common day parlance, they're all woke. So one of the things that even if they're not doing this for duty to the cause, to the revolution, to the party, to Marxism, Leninism, it's for family, it's for country, it's for the betterment of the Vietnamese people. The one thing you can't say about these women, even if they follow different causes, at the end of the day, that they were dedicated and they knew that what they were facing and their countrymen were facing was wrong, whether it be under French colonialism, whether it be from this American intervention that elongated, prolonged this very violent civil war that was taking place in Vietnam. Sorry,
so I'm just going to return to a question that Hang herself had sort of raised as something she wanted to ask, which was what happened to the sisters after the war? I think that's something that Katie Solon and others in the audience are also curious about. So if you could elaborate on that, since you would hope to do that before we turn to the public Q&A, that would be wonderful.
Sure. I have learned from, I mean, all of these women have legacies. The thing that I like to talk about that we don't have time to talk about is that in the face of all this personal dislocation and movement and war, each of these women crafts an amazing career. It's just remarkable. And I've learned recently, thanks to wonderful conversations with some nieces of the social worker Juan, and a very good friend of hers who is also a social worker, that Juan kept working at having social work accepted as a profession. And it's thanks to her badgering a lot of people through the many years after 75 until in the mid 2000s, a law was passed that basically did recognize social work as a profession. And as a result of that, and according to the nieces and the friend, there is there is a curriculum for social work in over 40 institutions across Vietnam. So that's what Juan spent her life on. And there's still a community center that's run by her colleagues. There's a scholarship that's given every year to encourage young people to work in social work. So even though Juan died 11 years ago, her work is continuing very much alive today. Another remarkable person is Chang, who she's the first Vietnamese woman to study at the Tchaikovsky Institute, and she comes back and becomes the first woman conductor of the orchestra of the symphony in Saigon. And just as girls all around the world need to see models, to see Chang up there with the baton, the maestro is a woman, is I think a huge, I don't know the specifics, but I am sure that has been an inspiration to many young women in the field of music as well. Others are Tan, the diplomat, unfortunately died of a very tragic incident, unbelievable, 20 years ago. But her work in diplomacy as the right-hand person to Madame Nguyen Thi Binh at the Paris Peace Talks, she was an incredibly gifted linguist and translator, and has translated many books since after she retired. So they all had remarkable careers, and those are felt. Liang An became another very small woman. She came back after 75 and became the headmistress at what had been the Lycée Chasseloup-Loba, which is the school for boys, the brother school to the Lycée Marie Curie, and she became the headmistress of what is now L'Équidon, and still a very highly respected high school. And after she retired from that, after working about 20 years from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. at night, because they had two shifts. After the war, there was just a great need to get people into the classroom. She did not retire long because she was asked by her district chief to head up a new little school for handicapped kids called L'École de l'Avenir, the school of the future. So even late in life, after formally retiring, she had an office in a garage of this house that had become a little school for the handicapped. I should mention before we run out of time, there are some pictures that allude to what some of the women have done since after the war on a website that my very dear and very talented nephew Daniel helped me prepare, called the Saigon Sisters.com. Do not forget because otherwise you'll bring up a menu to what looks like a really tasty Vietnamese restaurant in LA. But if you do the SaigonSisters.com, there's a wonderful website, thank you, Daniel, that for each sister, we have 7 or 8 pictures that span generally as kids, as little girls in their jupe at lycée through post-war years. So I hope everybody will have a chance to take a peek at that, as well as photos of supporting characters. There's some really remarkable sidebars to this book, that serendipity and also just very great kindness by some of the husbands and the teacher at the lycée, Mademoiselle Land, who gave generously of their time as well. Sorry, that was a long answer.
And I'll just wanted to remind you too that, so serendipity is a perfect word to describe what happens to them, because they still excel, even though they might not have, sort of majored in, say, music and gone to Tchaikovsky Institute, but it was for their time in the Maquis that shaped these skills that they had, that brought them to the very top of whatever profession they chose. And that's not to say, though, that they didn't face discrimination because precisely of their background. For those that didn't join the party, they still sort of rose to the top despite the sort of discrimination that they faced afterwards in 75. And all I wanted to say also to remind you is that they did meet up again, right? They did reunite. And if you could talk about that just quickly, what did they do when they all got together after 75?
No, well, that's a really good point. After all the trauma of decades of war, and again, a group of women who are flung in every direction as far as La Crosse, Wisconsin, and London, it's a miracle that they all survived, and then that they all returned to Saigon, and then that it was actually a death anniversary of another schoolmate from Lycée Marie Curie, Alice Schum. She died of cancer. And they all ended up going to her death anniversary in 1981. And a couple of them really liked reconnecting with, brought back memories of a time before all that suffering. And so Trien and Min in particular realized, hey, we're all back here in Saigon. We really should try to reconnect. And the last chapter of the book is about reuniting, and it's a very powerful thing about how comforting and reassuring it was to find each other alive, and also they trusted each other after decades of living in a wartime where subterfuge and suspicion is the currency. The fact that they found each other and found they could speak easily together, and that they did have that liberal education at the beginning, that there were many reasons that they found tremendous solace in reuniting.
Thank you for that. And I'll just note that I've shared the website for Kit's book in the chat box. So for anybody who wants to click through and see the pictures, the link is right there. I should note we have more than 17 questions left, and sadly not enough time to answer them all. So I will share whatever questions and comments we don't get to today with Kit afterwards, so she might be able to follow up with people if there's interest. But one that I think should be an easy, quick question to answer is, how many of the sisters are still alive today? And are they still in Saigon or have they moved elsewhere?
Yes, four of the nine are still alive, and they are all in Saigon. Unfortunately, they were born in the early 30s, so they're getting into the nano years, and I think some of them are frail physically, and maybe developing frailty otherwise. But all four of them are there. Two siblings, Min and Chang, and Twin is living with her son, and his wife is studying social work. She studied social work at Singapore. And then Swoon, the most lovely and elegant Swoon, is living with the son in Saigon. So yes, the Saigon Sisters, those who remain, are still in Saigon.
So we've had a couple questions that I'll summarize together, which is just, this is obviously great insight in a way that most previous books on this time period have not provided into the voices of women who are engaged during this era. So did the sisters feel compelled to tell you their stories? And how did they receive the questioning from an American visitor?
That's a super question, and I think Hang, did you do that question? No, I think this is where serendipity really comes to the fore. I have a background in French, as Hang pointed out. I lived in France as a child. I'm francophone, if not a fan of colonial history. But when Juan said Lycée Marie Curie, and I had studied something about French colonial history, and I knew that that only the privileged would go to a school like that. I had to ask Juan if she would be comfortable introducing me. They definitely did not look for this. And she thought about it, and then she agreed. And it was tricky at first because we taught, there's at one point in the Maquis, one of the apolitical ones doesn't like is you have to avoid the I. It has to be just we, and that's hard to do. But clearly some of them had trouble. It would be frustrating at the beginning. You'd say, for example, what was it like to go to the Maquis? Get out of your villa and go to the Maquis. Oh well, we would take a bus. I said I really had to pull it out quite a bit. Oh well, we only carried 2 sets of black pajamas, and then we crossed the street before dawn, and we met a liaison agent, and then she and I got up on the bus, and then we went out across the rice fields, and then just before the next town, the liaison agent said, "No, we're going to stop and get out here. Please stop the bus." And then so it took a while to just go from, well, we just got on the bus to, help me here. This has got to been, it had to have been a really difficult transition. So it took a while, and they were not eager to do it. And as one very poignantly put it, I'm uncomfortable. Many other women suffered more. Many didn't see the peace part as it was. And of course, that's right. But at the same time, there's so much we can learn from these stories, and I have to hope that they and their families are glad that they will not be forgotten, and their dedication to a cause much bigger than themselves will not be forgotten.
If I could just add in here, this is, as I was telling Kit, this is sort of like a gift from the heavens for teachers of the war in Vietnam, of this period, because it's very rare to get these sorts of snapshots. And they're more than snapshots, because Kit was able to follow them through this amazing period of upheaval in Vietnamese history. Usually we just get, sort of how they joined and what it was like, and then that's it. But the details that come out of this and the stories that continue after, because they're able to reflect upon their revolutionary careers. This is not your typical book. We don't have books like this as teachers, and so this is a huge service that Kit did for us as educators in this conflict. Oh, you're muted, Courtney.
apologies. I have muted myself because I have a dog in my apartment, and I forgot to unmute. So one other question, which may be our final question due to time, is when the sisters reunited, did you talk about what's happening in Vietnam today? And just specifically, did they have any thoughts or comments on the role of women in Vietnam today, having gone through so many difficulties and challenges themselves? Can you talk about their thoughts on women's role today in business, politics, society, or generally?
Wow, that's a super question. Super question. Hang, we're gonna have to tag team this. You know, that is such a great question. I wish I had been more explicit about asking that, but I think to give myself a little bit of an out for not fast forwarding to how they feel about the later years, I think these women, going back to being on the à la charnière, on the hinge of feudalism, the strength of their belief that while they loved their dad and they were remarkable, if sometimes dictatorial shapers of their lives, each of these women, it's so clear, felt that women should do more than stay at home. They should have ideas. They should have a role to play. It's a funny little story, but Trang, when she's in the maquis, she's so intent on showing that she can be as strong as the men that they recover an accordion from a French troupe, and she learns to play the accordion, and they show movies on a white sheet, Soviet movies, Armenian movies, and at one point her fingers are getting numb and she can barely keep playing, but she tells herself, I am going to keep playing because I want them to know that I am as good as a man. So I think that these women feel strongly, but it's more implicit that every woman has a great deal to give, and they certainly did their share.
I just say the Kit is when I started this in the introduction, I said that she's a very adept editor because her editorial hand is not heavy. It's not heavy-handed, and I think that the message that even if she didn't ask, even though you didn't ask the women specifically, what message would you like to give to younger Vietnamese women living in Vietnam? What's the takeaway? I think it's very clear without having to spell it out for us, which is that don't take for granted the liberties that you have, and don't become complacent. I think the one thing is that these women were very serious, and they were very serious about changing the situation that was facing Vietnam and their generation. They were a generation at the crossroads. And the worst insult that you could give to these women would be, you're going to grow up and be a woman of leisure. You're not going to do anything important with your life. You're going to enjoy being the upper class. That would have been the worst insult to put on their grave, and they did the exact opposite. And I think that that's the message that they're giving to young women today, which is, change and better the world. Be that for your family, be that for your party, be that for people in need. And that's that original comment about these women are woke, and they are woke 50 years ago. And I think that they would be, this would be this very important message at this time for the young generation, which is precisely that: get up and go out and do something and make change.
Yeah. If I could just add as one final note, I really appreciated a call with, I think somebody who's on this is participating, one of Juan's nieces. She was the first Vietnamese American I spoke with after the publication last month, and I was very touched and heartened by, she said, I'm really glad that you told the stories of the Saigon Sisters, because sometimes the history comes across as though only men fought in the war, as only men are heroes. But the Saigon Sisters fought in the war, and they are strong women, and this is part of our history too. So I really appreciate that feedback, and I hope others do the same.
Well, Thank you, Kit. Thank you, Hang. This was a fascinating discussion for me. We have a number of questions and comments that we're sadly not going to have time to get to today. So obviously there's a great deal of interest and passion for this particular topic, and I very much look forward to reading the book and hope that those on the call will be able to do so as well. So with that, I am going to end today's session. Thank you everybody for attending. We were so pleased to have this discussion, and we hope to continue conversations like this into the future. So thank you all.
Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Dr. Hang.
Thank you.